about where T cells are going to be, but you have to remember that T cells used to be called T cells because they were actually produced and matured within the thymus. B cells are generally going to be produced and matured in the actual bone marrow. But after about the age 5, 6, 7, both are pretty much matured within the actual bone marrow, red bone marrow, from pre-existing T cells that were created by the thymus when you were younger. And the thymus has a tendency to shrink. So most of your T and B cells, what she's talking about is different types of lymphocytes, which are leukocytes, but those are specific types. Most of them still come from the bone marrow, even though they're called T cells. It's hard to actually see those on histology slides, but we'll take a look at them. Most histology you're going to be looking at, you can be looking at, you'll be looking at some of the nodes, you'll be looking at some of the gland structures. You'll be looking at the spleen. It shows you the red pulp and the white pulp inside the spleen, which is different concentrations of different types of lymphocytes and so on. So we'll look at those after we go through this. This is a model that you definitely will see. They always use it on your lab exam. It is the model of a lobular structure. It's basically a combination of lobes of alveoli. An alveoli is a sac. This is alveoli. These are alveolus. And generally what they're going to test you on here, and there's a really good picture of this, by the way, since we're moving along fairly quickly. Where's respiratory? That's digestion. There you go. No, that's, if you don't see it, 689.
30.
639.
Might be wrong, it's a little bit.
Close enough.
633. It starts at 631.
So what you're actually looking at is two things. Tyler, over there where that mannequin parts are, you see lungs. You bring up a couple of lungs.
Go to this way.
So go to
This page,
Oh,
this
what?
page?
yeah, go to basically 638. I'll get that.
All right.
Thank you very much. Normally what they do with this, they'll start you off with the lung fields. Now you have one lung that's... Don't go by these because these kind of give you a misnomer. You have one lung that's bigger than the other lung. So if you look over here on page, let's go back just one.
His book's wrong.
Oh, wrong. 639. You can see that one lung has 3 lobes and another lung has 2 lobes. Well, the lung that has 2 lobes, it has 2 lobes because it's going to be the left lung, and that's where the heart has a tendency to protrude off to the left-hand side. So instead of having 3 lobes, it has 2 lobes, and it has a cardiac notch here where the actual apex of the heart comes into it. If you look at it, you'll see that one lung is a little bigger, one lung is a little smaller. Can you tell the difference between the two? Don't go by this, though. Do they look the same or do they look a little different?
A little different.
So which one do you think would be less?
The left one.
Generally the left one, because it loses a significant amount of tissue from the cardiac notch itself. So what you have to remember is you have to remember that the right lung and the left lung are different. The left lung has 2 lobes, the right lung has 3 lobes. Secondarily, you have to know the name of the separation of the lobes. So you have something like this, which is an oblique fissure, and this one is what? Justin?
Horizontal.
Horizontal fissure. Over here, what do you have? Just an oblique. Okay, so you have to nail those as well. When you look on the inside, you'll see that the diaphragm is on the bottom. But you have this is where the bronchi and the vascular structures and the venous structures and the lymphatic structures all go into the lung, all in one area. So they refer to that as a hiatus or a hilus. Bless you. Don't hold it in, just let it have it. So where all the structures come into the lung is called the pulmonary or pleural hiatus. So first study those. And then what leads to the lung is the larynx. It goes down to the trachea, into the bronchi, into primary, secondary, and tertiary before you get actually to the bronchioles. So let's look over here on 638, and you'll see the larynx, you'll see the trachea, and the bronchi. You have to actually be able to, we'll look at the larynx in just a minute. You have to go through the larynx and identify all the different cartilage structures in here. The actual Adam's apple is called the laryngeal prominence. And you'll see that the thyroid gland sits kind of right below it. You have the thyroid, you have the cricoid, and then here you have the voice box. Inside the voice box we have all sorts of things which we'll spend more time in detail next week on. Then you get into the trachea, and the trachea is not a complete ring. The trachea is an incomplete ring because on the posterior aspect of the trachea, it is not connected. These are hyaline rings, cartilage rings. Why is the posterior aspect not connected?
Esophagus?
So what?
Is it because the esophagus is in here?
Okay, and why?
Because it's connected right to it.
It's not connected right to it, but why should this not be connected if the esophagus goes up and down, John?
It's already protected by the spine.
No. Why is this not completely a round circle, knowing that the esophagus goes right behind it?
For expansion?
Yeah. What happens when you take food in? Your esophagus is a closed tube. You take food into that tube and it expands out as the food goes through and then it restricts. If this was not closed, you would have difficulty in swallowing. The food would be catching here. So this actually is an area that allows the trachea to move according to the amount of food. Some of us have a tendency in Western civilization to have large amounts of food in our mouth at one time and take huge swallows. So if you did not have that, you'd be choking every single time. Once it actually gets down to the bifurcation, right where the bifurcation occurs is an area called the carina. Should see it there somewhere. Do you have to know the carina?
Yeah.
Okay, so the carina is where the inferior aspect of the bifurcation from trachea to primary bronchi. Okay? From primary bronchi, the next breakoff is secondary, and the next breakoff is tertiary bronchi. Once you actually get away from the bronchial structures that have no more cartilages in them, then you get into the bronchioles. So let's turn our page to the bronchioles. On page 640, on the bottom right, you'll see bronchi, 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 and all of a sudden we get down to bronchioles, where you start losing the actual cartilage structures. Now this is a little interesting because if you look at this, the bronchioles are named not in appropriate sequence. First you start with the regular bronchioles, then the next bronchiole that comes up is a terminal bronchiole, but then one more bronchiole occurs right before it goes into the alveoli called respiratory bronchiole. So the terminal bronchiole is not literally the last bronchiole. In this case, it's the middle one. You go from bronchioles to terminal bronchioles to respiratory bronchioles to alveoli. This is when you get down to the alveoli. So let's turn the page. A couple of pages. Maybe. What page is it on? Here we go. On 644 and 645, you're going to see a fairly good representation of this model, especially on 644. So what you're looking at here, and remember, when you're evaluating this, they like to ask this question. They're going to say, ID this structure. It's red, which would make you think artery, but because it's in the lung field, it becomes venous. So this is what? Pulmonary vein. And this is the pulmonary artery. Okay? Remember that? Because pulmonary artery is bringing blood from the heart to the pulmonary arteries into here, comes down through here, goes through the alveolar structure, through the capillary beds, picks up oxygen, drains back into the pulmonary vein that's oxygenated, and takes it back to the heart to pump to the system. So don't be fooled by the colors. Anything in the pulmonary field, the same thing with this over here. They like to do this too because it's kind of tricky. They could point to the blue or the red and ask you to identify one of those. Anything in the lung field that's blue is an artery. Anything that's red is a vein in the lung field only. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So some of the common things they're going to ask you about, they're going to ask you, what is this structure here? What is this structure here? What are these structures here? What is this right here? This is an alveolar sac. These are the alveoli, and right in the middle is the alveolar duct. Okay, so there's lots of things you have to learn here. That page really tells you everything you need to know. And we also have, do they actually have an alveoli slide over there, Sean? Do you think they have a long slide? Not yet? Okay, maybe. So we'll just stick with but anyway, you'll have to identify, if you look at the bottom right of page 644 and the bottom left, you're going to see that's what the histology slide looks like of the alveoli. They're going to put that up there, and they're going to show you very thin, simple squamous is the actual alveoli walls, and then in between are the alveoli, alveoli duct, alveolar structures. There's another thing that occurs in here, and it's called surfactant. Has anybody heard of the word surfactant?
Yeah.
Surfactant is a secretion that is put around the alveoli. In fact, if you look over here, do they have surfactant cells anywhere? Oh, there we go, yeah. So on the outside structures, you're going to have this kind of this moist mucosal layer that goes around, and it keeps it moist so it doesn't collapse in on itself. So the lungs just don't, every time you exhale, they don't collapse in and have a pneumothorax every time you breathe. Secondarily, there is the outside layer that goes around here. If you look down here, what kind of tissue do you think that looks like?
Looks like simple squamous.
Probably going to be simple squamous. Okay. You also can see the capillary beds right here on the alveoli structure. And you can see over here is the surfactant, and then over here it has other tissue. What is some of the other tissue that you expect over here? This is in a septal area.
Like elastic.
It's elastic tissue. Allows the lungs to remain some form without constantly collapsing, but also the expansion and contraction has to have the ability to move. All right. Can't think of any other interesting models right now, but I'm sure I will in the future. What do we have here? Okay. So the rest of what you have to learn is going to basically be histology. So let's use the next period of time, get together with your groups, get the models out for, you can work off the torsos, you can work off the half head, make sure you understand those. I'm going to pop in some histology slides, and we'll go through those one at a time as well. Okay?